Okay, as I was saying, climate censorship. So you can see on the slide, I put one definition from well, it's a Chinese researcher that they conducted a lot of research on the Chinese case, particularly for what concern the Great Firewall that I'm gonna talk about as an example from an authoritarian regime that basically controls everything related to the communication that is given to the society. For climate censorship, we refer particularly for what concerns social media to the suppression, restriction, and manipulation climate-related information on digital platforms. This issue has gained significant importance in our current digital landscape because social media at the moment, and you can find so many different research and surveys regarding that, they are the main component that is used to get information. So they are the primary source of everything that comes from the society around us, and particularly from climate-related information. The way climate information is presented, shared, or potentially censored on this platform can have far-reaching consequences for our public understanding, policy making, and ultimately to our response to climate change. The main factor to understand in this case is that if there is censorship, this means that at a certain point there is only one perspective that is allowed, that is shared, and it is recognized. So the idea of having faction and friction won't exist anymore. And instead, science is based on open dialogue because through open dialogue, you have the chance of challenging previous knowledge and create new ones that can be shared and possibly understood by everyone. There is a really interesting concept that I will introduce and I will talk more that now has been used particularly with the diffusion of disinformation and censorship. There is the concept of news desert. At the moment, what we are seeing around the world is that we have towns or regions without reliable local news sources. I would use the word news desert for the kind of social media platform that we are using right now. So Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, TikTok, and all the growing ones. For the amount of disinformation and parallel censorship, they are becoming also these immaterial places news desert. So it's really important to understand this topic about censorship and disinformation. And I know that Martyna will go deeper in on this topic. So to just give you a general introduction about the topic, why social media are becoming the perfect breeding ground for both censorship and disinformation. They basically we have different psychological processes that happen at the same time. I will keep it brief for the sake of time, but the entire society is interested by specific psychological phenomena, specific cognitive biases. There are systematic errors in our thinking that stem from our propensity to use mental shortcuts. Cognitive biases are then connected to social biases. There is the tendency to trust information that comes from people that we know or with whom we identify. So in this case, we have the connection of two different psychological phenomena or factors, and these determine also the way that we access, process, and understand information. To these two, we have to add the algorithm biases that come from the courtesy of social media platforms themselves. So sites like, for example, Facebook, Twitter, and all the others tailor the content to, that you see every day based on what they predict. You react to, well, in this case, if we're talking about climate news, if you are climate deniers, they will continuously deny the existence of climate change, reinforcing the cognitive bias and the social bias. Together, this creates the perfect breeding ground for disinformation and censorship. So we'll move quickly to the different types of climate censorship. So I just put some of them, but there are so many subcategories. We have content removal, algorithmic suppression, shadow banning, fact-checking, controversies, and advertiser influence. Each one of them presents unique challenges to the free flow of climate information online. So let's start with content removal. Content removal is the most frequent one. These involve the deletion of posts, comments, or entire account discussing climate change. Throughout, the most recent researches are from 2015 till nowadays, the most important one from 2020, and they all highlight one fact, that, for example, particularly Facebook faces significant criticism when it spam filter algorithm erroneously and it remove posts sharing links to legitimate climate change articles. This is an incident that it wasn't like sporadic, particularly during, for example, US elections or even the European election, the most recent one. There were many cases. I'm focusing only on Facebook at the moment because it's particularly in scientific communication, engineering communication, it's renowned to be an environment that kind of promote disinformation. And in the US election, particularly during the Trump administration, and now with the European election, there were many posts that completely disappear for the sake of a specific political will. Meaning that this is something that I find particularly interesting. In my own career, I always thought that science was like a kind of a beacon of hope and something that will never bend to any other factors. But the more I work from the institutions and the more I study this kind of dynamics, the more I see that science bends to specific things such as economic interest and political will. Passing to algorithmic suppression, it's more subtle, but it's particularly impactful for the way that we understand and see the influence of climate change or our response to climate change. So social media algorithms reduce the visibility of climate-related content in user feeds, effectively limiting its reach. And this is connected to what we talked before about the psychological component. If I don't see news that contradict my own perspective, I will continuously reinforce my cognitive bias and dissonance. And these will lead to people that, not only to people, but to entire communities that lives inside these echo chambers, particularly younger generations that are continuously exposed to media or social media. And there is this other psychological phenomenon. I'm sorry, I'm saying a lot of theoretical things, and I will share at the end like an entire list of references that you can read from. There is called collective ignorance. What is collective ignorance? Is the idea that throughout the process of constantly reinforcing your own biases, and by engaging just with people from your own network with the same type of values, with the same type of beliefs, you will think at a certain point that the entire society thinks in the same way. And this is, as I say, called collective ignorance. And it can be in a good way. I mean, you're an activist and you think that all the other people are activists and believe in climate change, but also it works for deniers. And this reinforces also the idea of us, we see them. A striking example of that comes from the 2020 study by this American researcher, Brown, that published in one journal that's called Environmental Research Letters. And the study was incredibly interesting to read this paper because it was revealing that Twitter algorithm sometimes amplify the content from climate change deniers over content from climate scientists, potentially skewing user exposure to accurate climate information. You can understand that these can be used for specific interests. And I mean, now with Elon, we see even more this kind of component. Shadow banning. Shadow banning refers to the practice of limiting the reach of certain users or topics without their knowledge. In my own job, particularly when I was working in DG environment, I was dealing with a lot of influencers. At a certain point, the commission decided that in order to have to be more approachable, to be able to connect with people, they had to create a middle figure between the institution and the general society. And this was represented most of the time by influencers coming from specific countries or the target countries. And so in this case, I was mostly taking care of the influencers from Italy. And some of them, at a certain point, they just sent me an email and they say, our own profile, particularly on Instagram, was shadow banned. They couldn't post anymore. They had to create another profile. And they were following like a commission guidelines. They were following everything that I was writing for them in order to respect what to publish, when, and so on. This was a first example that I didn't notice, but a direct and impactful example of censorship. Many climate activists have reported throughout time that this sudden and unexplained drops in engagement of their posts, suggesting, well, in this case, shadow banning. And of course, if you're a climate communicator and activist that wants to reach a specific audience, and from day to night your profile disappears, this can really impact the way that you want to communicate in your own audience. And it's interesting that this kind of shadow banning interests just certain categories. I recently read this paper that it was, I'm sorry, I don't want to just to target the US, but there is quite a lot of research about disinformation and censorship in that context, as it's presented as an example of democracy that has the really similar methods to authoritarian regimes. And they were describing how shadow banning was conducting between Twitter and the previous Trump administration in order to completely censor every form of opposition. And now, because Europe, in a way, is the mirror, in a way, it's the mirror of what happened in the past in the United States. We are seeing something similar with the rise of far-right movements or parties. And I take my own countries at the moment in Italy. We have this phenomenon that is completely led by the government, where major profiles on social platforms or social medias are shadow banned or restricted in some way. And this comes to the next topic, that is fact-checking controversies. So while fact-checking is intended to combat misinformation, it can sometimes even indirectly lead to unintended censorship of climate content. A notable example, there is this American organization called the CO2 Coalition of climate skeptic groups, and they were continuously posting news about the non-existence of climate change, why we should not trust these people, and so on. And it's interesting that there were also some scientists involved, because even in the science, in the scientific community, there are people that, of course, that take a different function from the one that kind of for over 3 or 4 decades, they're repeating that climate change is the thing that we should be not only believe but do something about. But yeah, that's my own rant at the moment. Anyway, they successfully lobbied Facebook to categorize their content as opinion. On Facebook, there is the option of putting your own content as a different format. So if you are promoting, so it's an ad or it's an opinion and so on. By putting in this category, by putting it as an opinion, this exempted their post from fact checking. So this effectively allow the spread of climate misinformation under the guise of opinion. And this was used by other movements, not only for climate change, but for far-right movements to do propaganda and targeting specifically younger generation. In this case, we passed from Facebook to TikTok. At the moment, I'm following it's not directly connected to climate censorship, but more to sharing under the shape of opinion certain extreme perspectives. In Germany, there is quite a wide phenomenon with the rise of the far right, and TikTok at the moment is used to spread opinions and reverberate also on Facebook and Twitter from what is called Alternative for Deutschland. And the last one, advertiser influence. So economic pressure can lead to form of indirect censorship. particularly through advertiser influence. Platforms may suppress content that could upset major advertisers, because we have to realize that, as I say, there is the scientific knowledge, but then there is political will, and there is economic, different economic interest. And in this case, they have a voice that is way stronger than just scientific positions. So, for example, there is The Guardian also recently, I think it was August or July, published a new study regarding this influence. But the one that I find particularly meaningful is from 2020, because it was Google that was accepting advertisement from major fossil fuels companies and placing them alongside climate-related content. And of course, if you are a reader and you see this kind of framing, you are strongly influenced. There were many accusations also of this kind of format, of this kind of framing during COP last year. And I'm really scared of seeing the same thing now that I will go to Baku, that both in real time and online, there will be a strong influence, particularly for climate-related news, from lobbies. It's not. I'm not discovering anything that people weren't aware of, but it's better to kind of reiterate this kind of concept. And as they say in Latin, repetita iuvant, that lobbies and big companies, they have a strong influence in the way that we perceive and understand information. So I will pass to another part. There is the landscape of climate censorship, and particularly I will focus on self-censorship. There is a phenomenon that is becoming pretty big also in the scientific community. So what I mean by government imposed censorship. So I just want to clarify that the main concept, I already introduced them. So I'm going deeper in each one of them in order for you to have a better understanding. So at the beginning of my explanation or the introduction, I was talking about the Great Firewall from China. So government imposed censorship varies, of course, depending on the political system. But particularly, we have incredibly interesting examples from authoritarian regimes. The problem is that now democratic ones and authoritarian ones are kind of blending, are kind of mixing. It's not that easy anymore to say which one is a democratic, which one is authoritarian. And it's a personal opinion, but of course you can see with your own eyes. China employs a sophisticated system of censorship that, as I say, is called the Great Firewall. And there were many researches regarding that, particularly so I studied in Sweden. I studied in the Uppsala University, and for a period I was writing about climate censorship and the promotion of disinformation by the Chinese government. And it was incredibly fascinating how you can manipulate an entire population to believe something. And it was also interesting to see when there were Chinese students coming to Uppsala, to Sweden, that they were facing different type of information and the clash between their type of knowledge and the Western one. Anyway, so there is this researcher, Zhang, that in 2022 analyzed climate change coverage in Chinese newspapers, and that was also reported on social media from 2000 to 2020. And it saw that the discourse strategically aligns constantly with state interest. It was never based on scientific information. They were never cited the researcher, the scientist, and so on. It was always the Chinese government say that, or that the Chinese government representatives discovered these new things, completely taking accountability for the new discoveries that were manipulated in specific ways. So the discussion on climate change impacts completely the Chinese perspective on the topic. And not only I'm taking the Chinese one just as an example. And now we'll talk about a democratic one. So I was talking before about the Trump administration. And there are many reports that I will put also in the bibliography that I will share, about climate-related information being completely removed from government websites. So there is a responsibility from a federal, both federal media, meaning digital one and also on papers, to be transparent and accountable for what they share. So there are really specific guidelines on what to do, particularly for the United States, also in Europe, but at the moment I'm focusing on this one. And these type of information, the climate war, were completely removed. And what is interesting is that something similar happened instead when there was Al Gore, that instead is a big promoter of climate-related information. When Tanya was describing my title, Climate Reality Project is the one that is promoted by Al Gore. But instead, there was another type of censorship. So the censor was for all the one from deniers of climate change, and instead pushing only climate-related information. The main point that I wanted to highlight, which is different between Trump and Al Gore, is that there is always some sort of manipulation. Doesn't matter if it's in favor or against climate change or the climate crisis. The point is that we should have open access to a variety of perspectives and information. Of course, we don't have to be overwhelmed by disinformation, but the fact that just one way of thinking is pushed and is promoted, that's really dangerous. Doesn't matter what is the perspective. Moving on, platform-driven censorship, we already talked about, but I found that there is particularly interesting one example. So Facebook, if you look at the story of Mark Zuckerberg, there were many examples of him trying to, like in court, they was talking about how he was trying to make Facebook more reliable and all the other platforms connecting to Facebook. So there is this case about the creation of the Facebook Climate Science Information Center that was launched in 2020, and it was the amount of criticism was insane. The intention was to provide authoritative climate information, but the result was that, let's say inadvertently, but I don't know about this part, it suppressed a lot of legitimate climate discussion because it was filtering so much that he reached the level of censorship of also those that were climate-related information from authoritative sources. And this was one example. And again, Zuckerberg had to go to court for that. But another factor I already talked about, the algorithm bias. Also, we can find example on YouTube. There is this really interesting study by a Spanish researcher, Ava, that conducting this research on YouTube. And YouTube, now we have all these social medias that respond to your own input. So you're interested in, I don't know, videos of cats. The more you watch videos of cats, the more you will get videos of cats. So we have this algorithm that work in favor of feeding your own addiction. So YouTube recommendation algorithm was driving users toward climate misinformation videos. And it was completely and effectively censoring factual climate content from users' feed. And this is an example that I really recommend to read this paper by Avad, because it shows exactly a pattern that it lasted for almost 5 years, from 2015 till 2020. And it's incredible how many people were interested by that. And what's interesting is that in that period of my life, I was particularly interested in one type of videos on YouTube, in scientific ones with a specific style, that is the animation one. And I really recommend, if you're interested in climate change, astrophysics, in general, science, Kurs de Gesagt is my favorite one. And during that period, I was having problem, particularly in 1920, because I was using for some research, to access the videos that I was looking for. The day before they were there, and the next day they weren't there. And then, well, 1 year later, I read the paper of Avats. But anyway, self-censorship. So why I say that I will dig deeper into this topic because it's a topic that at the moment I'm researching on, both for the commission and for my own interest. This is the most insidious form. Many individuals refrain from posting about climate change due to the fear of negative reaction or professional consequences. Particularly, the Pew Research Center conduct a lot of surveys about this topic, and well, mostly about Americans, but there are like worldwide researches. But they found out in 2022 and also the most recent one in 2024 that between 49 and 55% of Americans say they rarely or never post about climate change on social media because they are scared of negative reaction. The phenomenon, as I said before, extends also to the scientific community. There are different studies, one from the Global Environmental Change from 2021, but the most recent one, in order to show something that is closer to the European situation, was conducted by Virgin Media and O2 and Global Action Plan. And it was specifically about the United Kingdom, specifically for a younger generation between 16 and 24. And what they show is that we have young researchers that are particularly scared of sharing climate-related information because they don't want to be labeled as alarmists. This self-censorship can, of course, significantly impede the flow of critical climate information to the public. What is interesting is that we have the percentage is not so high. We are still talking about 25% out of a pool of people of 2,000 people, 2,000. But what is interesting is the contrast with the 89% of people that declare themselves concerned about the climate. So we have a scientific community that is concerned about the climate crisis, but doesn't speak up. This is a paradox. And I like this expression from, I don't remember the name of the scientist that say, he repeats, it's a paradox. And he say that the more the temperature rises, the colder the debate becomes. And this is like, I think that it's quite symbolic. I will have to speed up, I think, because I see the time and I'm talking a lot. I will move to the next slide. Mechanism of climate censorship. I will be brief on this one. Yeah, I basically already introduced them. So legal and political mechanisms, technological means of suppression, and economic pressures. Nothing that I didn't already said. I will just dig a little bit into few examples that I think are meaningful, particularly if you're using Instagram. At the moment, I don't know if you know what is the Climate Pact. Is this network that the main intention is kind of to raise awareness about climate change, connect more from a bottom-up level. And it's promoted by DG COMM, so from the European Commission itself. It's, I don't remember, I think it's 4 or 5 years that it's on. And what is interesting is that at a certain point, while they were promoting their own news, they were noticing that, because I conducted research for them, they were noticing that people weren't engaging. And what they found out is that, and I'm talking from a technological perspective, there was an algorithm bias, meaning that Instagram, particularly on Instagram, wasn't allowing the use of specific hashtags, particularly climate strike. And so there was a combination of algorithm bias and shadow banning. And it was reported by the Climate Pact, so from DG Climate itself and by many climate activists. And several Instagram users, including DG Climate, as I said before, reported that posts using this hashtag, it was in this case both climate strike and also, I don't remember, I think it was just Climate Pact, they weren't showing in the searches. So, of course, people weren't engaging. The component that I think is the most interesting, particularly nowadays, is the economic pressures. Economic factors can lead to subtle forms of climate censorship. For example, I said before about fossil fuel companies and lobbyists. There is one analysis from Global Environmental Action that found out that and it just came out, I think 2 weeks ago, 6 of the world's biggest polluters are responsible for placing more than 1,700 of the basically they are over polluting the social media with the news about fossil fuels, and at the same time they are defining deals with major platforms in order to have only this kind of information online. They are completely manipulating the way that we perceive climate change and environmental issues. One great example is the one from ExxonMobil. ExxonMobil, it's an American company that paid for 350 ads they were basically intended to influence the proposed legislation in New York State regarding natural gas for new buildings. And at the same time, in the way that they paid, there was a small, how can I say, a small component in the deal that they defined with the New York State that it was about censor any kind of other news that was saying something against the use of about phasing out. Okay, we move to the next one, and of course, I hope that there will be questions because I'm talking a lot, and I know that perhaps there are things that are unclear, and I'm more than happy to answer. The impact of climate censorship. So, I mean, it's quite obvious that with this kind of conditions, you will have a huge impact in the way that people get information, so the access, understand, and also engage. And I don't have to explain so much, but public discourse and awareness. But what I mean by that, there are many researchers, particularly by the Pew Research Center and by Reuters, that are basically showing that, of course, if the type of information that you access it's limited, this severely limit the public's access to instead what is reliable, what can be considered scientific proof about climate-related information. And this reinforce echo chambers in climate discussion in favor and against, because also we have to consider that there are scientific communities that they just talk among each other without sharing this kind of information. This is like, if I could, I will wink to the academic world. And this also reinforces the perspective of the academic environment and institution as ivory towers that don't share information with the general public. But a strong role is determined by the censorship that is applied on a bigger level from a top-down approach. And we'll say that it could be the biggest impact. Of course, it depends from your perspective. For me, that I still work in the institutions, I see that quite frequently is the impact on policy and governance. Climate censorship on social media can have far-reaching effects on policymaking. There was a 22 study in the journal Environmental Politics that found a correlation between increased social media censorship of climate content and decreased public support for climate policies. But we don't have only to focus on climate policies in order to understand that. We saw during the US election, European election, any kind of election at the moment, you see that the disengagement is incredibly high because there is this strong influence that is determined by cascade effect, meaning if you don't have a public discourse, meaning engagement, if there isn't the scientific or in general the community of experts that is involved, this leads to consequences in the way that people interact with governance, with the entire policy making and decision making process. And we saw the effect that just a really small part of the society vote, really small part of the society engage with the political class, and in this case, this has consequences also for climate change related information. Let's move on. Let me see. Yeah, I put some strategy to address climate censorship. But please, Tanya, tell me if I have still time or I should speed up even more.
I'm thinking that you can go on for about 5 more minutes max.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So the first one, the platform. Okay, platform policy reform. So I try to select some solutions, some stuff that we have to consider in order to address climate censorship. What I mean by platform policy reform, ideally, we all the different social media platforms, they should aim for transparency. This is not the case. Transparency, in particular, in content moderation. Platforms should provide detailed explanation when climate-related content is removed or suppressed. But most of the time, particularly, I don't know, at the moment, as the boomer that I am, I'm trying to do videos also, still nothing is online, on TikTok. I'm trying to understand how it works. When I'm talking with a lot of environmental influencers, and they say that sometimes they get their own post removed or suppressed, and there is no explanation. And instead, it's really important to understand the reason why something is removed or suppressed. This is a core component for people to understand how to engage and interact with climate-related information. The transparency can help users to understand why certain content is flagged, and in this case, they can also hold platforms accountable for their decision. Another important reform is the implementation of robust appeals processes. As I said before, platforms, they should be accountable. Users should have access to a timely and fair system to appeal content removal or demonetization decision. I think that it's the basis. We should have independent oversight boards. And what I mean by that, all major platforms, they should provide an extra layer of scrutiny that it isn't directly connected to the same social platform. Otherwise, it's completely biased. But for the digital literacy initiatives, I mean, in my own free time and sometimes for my own work, I do a lot of eco-education. So I try to teach about climate communication, and knowledge is the key. So empowering users with knowledge can help mitigate the effects of climate censorship. So we should completely redefine the type of educational programs that we have, developing collaboration with climate scientists and educators that can help users better understand how to navigate climate information in social media. Because at the moment, like, I didn't receive any kind of knowledge on how to deal with social media. I don't think that new generation have any type of knowledge. And it's not about the new generation. It's about the older generation that are teaching old methods on how to deal with information. And this is something that we have to change. And additionally, we have to improve and develop and promote fact-checking tools on all the social media platforms. I really recommend the Silencing Science Tracker, that it's a joint initiative of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law and the Climate Science Legal Defense Funds. And I think from 2020, I don't remember now. Anyway, it's mostly for the US, but it's still a great example to see the impact of climate censorship. And they track all the example of censorship throughout the years, and they created this huge file that you can consult and see what was the censorship. Let me see. And I mean, from a legal and regulatory approach, definitely platforms should be accountable, as I say, from a regulatory perspective, requiring platforms to disclose their content moderation policies and algorithm ranking criteria, because it's not possible that certain type of reliable sources that just disappear, or that you're not able to complain and have an answer back that it's based on something that you can actually understand why it was removed, for what reason. And then the last point, and I think the most important one, yes, we have all these main platforms, Instagram, Twitter, and so on, but there are also alternative ones. And it's also important for us, activists, to understand and promote also alternative sources of information. At the moment, there is quite a big deal with the creation of blockchain-based social media platforms that are resistant to centralized censorship. I don't know when it will be possible to do something like that, but I really hope so, because it will be like a great solution. And also we should support the development of open source decentralized social media, because as I said before, we need open dialogue. It's not about one way of thinking. Yeah, I will say that it's all from my side. I will just conclude with one last thing. There is just the main concept I would like to transmit with this presentation. I'm a scientific communicator. I'm an environmental journalist. I try to be an educator. I strongly believe in the value of science. If there isn't open discussion, there is no science. Just as free press is essential for democracy, open discussion is fundamental for science. So when the government muzzles scientists for political reason, it cuts the fundamental principle of good science and good democracy. So science requires open debate. In this case, as we're talking about climate change, climate change requires open debate. It does not advance by consensus or political pressure. Yeah, that's all from my side. I hope that it was clear. I hope that the Italian accent wasn't too strong, and I hope that you enjoy it.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Stefano. And I love the final note. I'm currently doing a master's in culture and democracy, and we're talking a lot about this and living in the tension and just the conversations needing to happen and consensus not being something to search for, because you will always have new issues to talk about. So very good point and very, very interesting presentation. I personally feel like I learned a lot, and I think I can speak for everyone listening. I'm thinking that we can move on to Martyna's presentation, just to make sure that you also have the time to do everything, and then we take all the questions in the end. So if anyone has any questions, to not forget them, write them down, and then we can take them when we finish. So I will start sharing your presentation, Martyna, and the floor is yours.
Okay, lovely. Now I can see it. Okay, well, thank you so much for the presentation, Stefano. I thought it was really interesting. And you're right, my presentation kind of touches upon yours. And there was a few moments, or maybe just one, but when you said that I'm going to elaborate a bit more on certain topics, and that is true. I will be focusing on how to spot and fight disinformation, but also what disinformation is in itself. So if you could move on to the next one. So yes, basically what, how, and how do I work? How do I respond? How do I work with this disinformation, as in, like, how do I notice it? How do I fight it? How do I respond to it? But also, how can I teach other people how to respond to it? Okay, the next one. So what is disinformation? Disinformation is when a person or organization intentionally spreads information they know to be false or misleading. And oftentimes, disinformation is harmful. So it actually can be used as a tool to do harm, mostly for political purposes, but that's not always the case. And to the next one, thank you. So it can be very difficult to tell what is true and what is false. For example, there's 3 examples here. On the first one, as you can see, I don't know if you guys are into pop culture or not, but it's Olivia Rodrigo and Sabrina Carpenter talking. And some people might say that it's quite unlikely that the two of them talked, and maybe it's a deep fake. Well, actually not. They did talk at Met Gala, and this is a real photo. For example, the middle photo shows the activation by Israel of the dome, of the Iron Dome, but it's on the wrong date. So it involved different actors that the screenshot showed that it did. So in that sense, it's really important to remember that sometimes it can be the description that involves disinformation. Sometimes it can be the photo itself that is not true. So for example, the last example that we have, the cover of Forbes was completely AI created, right? So it's not an actual photo. It's not an actual cover. It was generated by the artificial intelligence. Next one, please. Thank you. So this is a photo of the Pope. And I don't know if you guys saw it or if you've seen it before. The moment I saw it for the first time, I was quite young. I think I was around, I don't know, let's say 15. And I genuinely believed in it. I thought that the Pope was actually wearing this puffer jacket. And only when I started working with disinformation, I had found out that it's actually a deep fake. So it's an AI generated photo. To say that I was confused is to say nothing. But yes, I just wanted to expose you to a funny example, right? Because if you could, Tanya, just click once more and once more. Exactly. So sometimes AI or disinformation is used to create things for humor, right? So in this case, that's why I said that it's not always to do harm. Sometimes it's just to make you laugh. So yeah, and the next one. Apart from humor and satire, there's also disinformation used to deceive people, right? So we can, actually, no, I'm not going to get into it. I'm going to get into it later. Let's focus on the second part of this, which is misinformation, not to be confused with disinformation. Misinformation is false or misleading information shared by people who believe it and do not want to cause harm. So those people often try to help you. For example, your granny telling you during COVID times that if you eat a lot of garlic, you will be healthy and you will treat COVID. She doesn't mean any harm with it. It's just something that she believes in that is misinformation because it's not true, but there's no bad intention behind it. Okay, next one, thank you. And if you could click a bit more, yeah, okay. This is yet another example of disinformation and how it can be used, because speaking of COVID, some people, maybe you remember, some people spread information that 5G causes and spreads coronavirus, which of course is not true. But there were conspiracy theories about such spreads. And it not only contributes negatively to the society itself because it is disinformation, but it also caused some vandalism, right? Because people started to destroy 5G towers, let's just say. But it also disrupted the telecommunication services. Some people were harassing telecom services employees. So it got a bit intense. And in that sense, you know, it's an example of how it not only stays with your opinion, but sometimes it gets a bit out of hand and people actually starts to act on the disinformation that they heard about. Next one. Okay, so here, disinformation, I think it's quite an interesting example, because there's the same, if you look close to the pictures, it is the same woman. It is the same woman who pretends to be different people. And it's, I don't think this was meant in a funny way. I think this was meant in an intentional way, right? So this is a woman. In the first photo, you see that she's a mother from Ukraine. Then she's a vice chair of a Russian religious foundation. Then she's a lawyer. Then she's a citizen of Kharkiv. And it's just, it's an example of how disinformation doesn't only involve AI, like I mentioned before. It can also involve real people who actively engage in disinformation. So here she was doing this to deceive people and to promote Russian political goals, right? So she appeared in all of these roles within 1 year. And yeah, it shows how real people might not stick exactly to the message that the people behind the propaganda want to deliver. So they use professional actors to impersonate various emotionally moving characters. And this aims to manufacture pro-Russian and anti-Ukrainian sentiments. Okay, next one. So how does this information work? And then of the next one, so there's a few different ways of how people can engage in it. Disinformation spreaders use mainly social media to flood information space. That's how we call it. We call it a flood of information. Their aim is not necessarily to convince you of one particular story, but rather to confuse you or overwhelm you to the point that you don't know whom to trust, right? You're so confused that you kind of lose the information truck. The goal is to basically undermine our trust in mainstream media and in democracy as a whole. So here we have a few techniques. So for example, whataboutism. I think it's quite common as well in real life debates. Maybe you can notice that sometimes. Whataboutism is, it means that instead of discussing the topic at hand, the commenter draws attention to an unrelated or distantly related topic. For example, in a discussion about Russian invasion of Ukraine, someone asks, "Oh, what about Somalia?" Right? So it's not a constructive discussion anymore. It's not a constructive discussion about Somalia even. It's just to distract you from the topic of what you're actually discussing. Another one is a straw man. So someone misunderstands or misrepresents your position and attacks that point instead. So example, you're talking about the importance of Europe being climate neutral, and someone talks about how they can't believe that you want to build wind farms in all of the national parks, right? So like it's kind of completely, it wasn't your point. That's not what you were discussing. But they're so focused on that new point that they created that they're just kind of bombarding you with negative comments about this misrepresented point. And then there's the attack. So someone uses negative or aggressive language to discourage you from further discussion. And you can see things like, "Oh, what an idiot, only idiots believe," stuff like that. So it's kind of missing the point, but it's also very aggressive. Then it's mockery. So someone uses sarcasm to belittle you. For example, "Oh, I can't believe I don't know, like, oh, you really have to take everything seriously. Oh, why do you have to take the fun out of everything? It's just kind of to disencourage you to make the next point. And then the next one is overwhelming with detail. Basically, someone provides you with so many details. It's mostly technical details that you're not fully aware of or that you haven't heard before. That someone just like, maybe they have the knowledge, maybe they're completely figuring out as they go, but they overwhelm you with it, right? So you don't really understand what's going on, and then you're like, okay, you know what? Fair enough. I don't want to talk about it anymore. Yeah, so those were the main techniques. Oh yeah, and here I wanted to tell you that I kind of mentioned it before, that it's not only on social media, it also happens in traditional media outlets. So be careful with what you watch on TV, what you read in newspapers, you know, especially if the TV is state-owned and a certain political party takes over the state. There's different things that might happen. Trust me, I am from Poland. We had different things in the last few years when the public television became a means for basically political propaganda. So yeah, I just wanted to put it out there. And then I have a few videos, I mean, not a few, but just 2 videos. Do you think we can play it as 2 minutes, or do we not have time for it? So maybe just to put you in the context, so this video is produced by EU versus Disinformation. So it's a specific unit within the it's not the European Commission, but it's a unit created by the European Commission, and they deal with disinformation in particular. And this video explains how the so-called propaganda videos, so disinformation videos, are created. And this uses examples of photos and videos. So you will be able to see how the false narratives are constructed bit by bit. It's quite primitive, but I think it's good to see how simple it is to confuse people with very simple means. Well, this one is more of a satirical one. So this is basically a deep fake created by the AI. And I saw this and I was like, wow, I had no idea how advanced that thing is, because I mean, the possibility of Keanu Reeves actually doing that is very low. So the AI created this, and yeah, I think we can just give it a watch to see how well they can make it work. Right. So this is yet another video that this one is very short, but I meant another one of 20 of the 2 minutes. But maybe this one we can share on through the chat. So as I told you guys, it's quite a primitive example, especially with the leaving the country picture. I thought it was quite funny, but you get the gist of it, right? So it's quite easy to come up with something containing disinformation. Then comes the video with Keanu Reeves, but we've already seen it. So now I want to talk a bit about how we can respond to it. So maybe the next one. This is just very basic. So don't be tricked into reacting. This is sometimes reaction is exactly what they want to get out of you, to basically comment something to make the post more popular and pop up in other people's feeds. So don't always react to things. You know, inaction is also a choice that you can engage with. So yeah, pause. And the next step is think. And the next slide, please. So then these are some things that you can do when in doubt. Okay, so first, the content itself. Read the whole article or watch the whole video. Does the headline match the content? Is it cohesive? Does it all make sense? Then the next one, the outlet. What other stories does the source publish? Do they look reliable? Are they all a bit dodgy about a certain topic that has a certain narrative? You know, see a bigger perspective when it comes to the source. The author. Is the person who is publishing it an actual person? Is it an AI source, right? We don't know that, so it's good to check it. If it is a person and they are an actual physical person who is an author, it's often good to check the other articles that they wrote or the videos that they made, right? So just to double check what other works they have published. Then there's the date. Is it old? Is it new? Is it recent? Because sometimes, especially on Twitter, people scroll way back from like 2015 and then they comment by retweeting, they comment on something from way back and use it for narratives that are around in 2024, right? So like, oh, look what this person said, but hold on, it was actually 10 years ago, so it doesn't really make sense anymore. So it's always good to double check the date. The image, that's more about Instagram posts. So like, if you see a post and you see a caption, maybe read both, see if the picture is not just there to bring your attention, because sometimes this is what they do. And other sources. That's also interesting because you can always double check with other outlets, right? So do other sources cover the story? Do they support claims made by the author that you're reading? What types of sources are they? Are they reliable ones? The big ones, you know, BBC, Deutsche Welle, France 24, like, are those the type of sources that also cover it? Because then it gains reliability. And the next one, please. Yeah, well, think before you share. That's the whole point. And then maybe next one, the fact checkers. Also next one. We can skip that one. Yeah, thank you. There's a few places on the internet where you can fact check what you're reading, which I think is really cool. So this is just a list of certain standards or organizations or fact checkers where you can go to just to fact check your information. So here we have the International Fact Checking Network, and I think there's also links if you click on it, so you guys can also click on it if the presentation will be shared, which I'm assuming it will. Yeah, so you can also check the sources. They're very useful, especially when you make a presentation or you do some research for school, for university. It's always good to double check if you're not sure. There's a Google's fact check explorer. So you can search online about a topic or a person. And there's the website, the EU versus Disinformation, which I already mentioned. They're actually really cool. So they have different subsections on climate, on the Russia's invasion on Ukraine. And you can honestly just go there and see different disinformation that has been spread by different sources, and you can kind of just look through it and maybe have a little laugh, because sometimes they're actually ridiculous. So it's also cool to check out. And then there's the EDMO, which is the European Digital Media Observatory, and they basically keep up to date with the disinformation online. So they monitor and react. And the next one, this is a national fact-checking resources. So you guys can see where, I don't know where you are from, but let's say that I am from Poland. So there's Czechia, Slovakia, and Polish one, that's CEDMO. And then I can also, this is also connected to links. So you can just kind of follow the links of the country. And then you'll see a website with your national fact-checking resources, which I think is also very useful. And yes, that's all I prepared for you. So thank you so much, guys, for hanging around and listening to what I had to say.